You know, you hear from a lot of people that call themselves watchmen that the division of God's land is about to happen and all of this stuff, but they don't think about this fact that the land was already divided a long time ago. And I kind of wanted to share some of this history with you because a lot of people don't seem to know that the land was already divided up. And this is not necessarily something that is something we're waiting to happen, because it already happened. And I wanted to read the scripture in Joel 3:2 that says, I will gather all nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. There I will put them on trial for what they did to my inheritance, my people Israel, because they scattered my people among the nations and divided up my land. So here's the truth about God's land being divided up. The land that is now Jordan was part of the Ottoman Empire until World War I by the Ottoman invaders, the Muslims. After the war, the League of Nations granted Britain a mandate over the area, which included both present-day Jordan and Israel/Palestine. In 1921, Britain established the Emirate of Transjordan, which later became the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan in 1946. So Britain is what divided up God's land. So doesn't it make sense that King Charles III, part of the British Empire, so to speak, they're not what they formerly were, but wouldn't it make sense that the end-time king that would have control would be King Charles III? It does to me. And the territory was distinct from the areas designated for Jewish settlement under the British Mandate for Palestine. Various partition plans, including the 1947 UN partition plan, proposed separate Jewish and Arab states, but did not allocate Jordanian territory to Israel. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War resulted in the establishment of Israel and the annexation of the West Bank by Jordan, which is the former capital of, Judea and Samaria, where Hebron is, where King David ruled for many years there, and further solidifying the separation of the two territories. Today, Jordan and Israel are separate sovereign nations with a peace treaty established in 1994. So the area that God commanded that Israel would have includes that whole territory that became the nation state of Jordan. And a lot of people do not know that Winston Churchill played a huge role in the establishment of the Jewish state from the British kingdom. So the assertion that Winston Churchill drew a line with a crayon to create a Jewish state boundary is a simplified and potentially misleading version of the events. Here's what the evidence suggests. Churchill's role in the Transjordan, while serving as colonial secretary in the early 1920s, was involved in the decision to separate Transjordan, now the Kingdom of Jordan, from British Mandate Palestine. So at the time, because the land had been renamed by one of the Roman emperors to Palestina in a joke about the Philistines being Israel's ancient enemies, everybody that lived in the land at the time, including Jews, were considered from Palestine because the name had been changed. So a lot of these protesters don't know their history. Stroke of a pen account, Churchill himself is reported to have boasted that he created Transjordan with the stroke of a pen one Sunday afternoon in Cairo. And while this statement refers to the establishment of Transjordan, it does not explicitly mention a Jewish state or the use of a crayon. Winston's hiccup. There are anecdotal accounts suggesting that when drawing the boundary for Transjordan, Churchill's penmanship was wobbly, potentially due to intoxication, resulting in an erratic or unusual border shape, and this has been referred to as Winston's hiccup or Churchill's sneeze. Impact on the Jewish state. Churchill's separation of the Transjordan from Palestine laid the groundwork for the 1948 agreement on Israeli statehood by defining the territory remaining for a potential Jewish state. So basically, he created the borders with his pen, the piece of land that is a teeny tiny piece of what God had originally ordained. And the whole area of the Sinai region was given back to Egypt. In summary, while Churchill's action did play a role in shaping the geopolitical landscape that would eventually include a Jewish state, the idea of him drawing the border with a crayon, especially for the Jewish state specifically, is likely an exaggeration or a misrepresentation of historical events and anecdotes related to the creation of Transjordan. Now, this is written by Dory Gold, and it's titled Churchill's Promised Land. And it's about Zionism and Statecraft by Michael Makowski. So here's how this all came about in the first place, and the dividing of God's land. Now notice that the dividing of God's land, and every time it's talking about God judging the nations, it's always saying the nations that are surrounding God's Holy Land. So those nations are going to come under judgment. And Winston Churchill is not usually regarded as one of the leading British statesmen responsible for Britain's backing of the Zionist movement and the resurrection of the Jewish national home. The names of Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour, who authored the Balfour Declaration, or his Prime Minister David Lloyd George, more readily come to mind. Indeed, Churchill, who in the early 1920s became colonial secretary, is more associated with the 1922 decision to cut off 75% of the territory of British Palestine from the proposed Jewish nation home, is more associated with the 1922 decision to cut off 75% of the territory of British Palestine from the proposed Jewish nation home to create Transjordan in order to give the Hashemite dynasty from Arabia a consolation prize of sorts after their loss of Syria to the French. Now, the Hashemite king, they were connected to the power in Syria. So a lot of people don't know this, but this decision cut off 75% of the territory of British Palestine that was proposed for the Jewish nation home. And instead they created Transjordan, which became Jordan, with the Hashemite king in charge. And he's been controlling the Temple Mount ever since. So Michael Makowski helps dispel this perception of Churchill in his highly readable Churchill's Promised Land, Zionism and Statecraft, and he discloses how Churchill already expressed his support for restoring Jewish nationhood in Palestine in 1908, 9 years before it became British policy. In a written message to the English Zionist Federation in Manchester, which was read aloud in his absence, Churchill, in fact, wrote, "I am in full sympathy with the historical, traditional aspirations of the Jews." Churchill opposed the idea of seeking an alternative Jewish homeland in East Africa, which was under consideration in certain Jewish circles at the time. Can you imagine that? And instead focused on Palestine, even while it was still formally part of the invading Muslim Ottoman Empire. He concluded his 1908 remarks as follows: "Jerusalem must be the only ultimate goal. When it will be achieved, it is vain to prophesy, but that it will someday be achieved is one of the few certainties of the future." So apparently he knew it was in the Bible, in prophecy, that one day, it's hard for us to imagine Israel not being a nation for thousands of years, but it was something that people couldn't understand. So they tried to interpret Bible prophecy according to how it was without the Jewish nation rebuilt. So they got a lot of things wrong, I might add. Churchill's Zionism did not come out of a vacuum. Like others in this area, he became a believer in Jewish restoration, reestablishing the Jewish people as a sovereign nation. His father, Randolph Churchill, was cut from the same philo-Semitic cloth, championing Jewish rights in his public addresses. Both were inspired by the great British conservative leader and former Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, who, though born into a Jewish family, was baptized as a child and became a member of the Church of England. Well, if you know anything about Queen Victoria and her history, she constantly met with Benjamin Disraeli, and, they would go on, the Queen would go on vacation to Scotland and take Benjamin Disraeli for these talks, up in the Highlands and everything. So this is truly something else. So Disraeli visited Jerusalem in 1831 and later wrote a novel about a Baghdadi Jew who dreams of leading his people back to Jerusalem to restore their national existence. It was a time when Lord Palmerston, the British Foreign Secretary, was pressing the Ottoman Sultan to allow the Jews to return to Palestine. Makovsky delves into this history to better understand the milieu in which both Churchills received their political education. For after Disraeli's death in 1881, Randolph Churchill tried to claim his political mantle. As Makovsky details, Winston Churchill was fully aware of the Randolph Churchill-Israeli political connection, protesting the anti-Semitic pogroms in Russia in 1905. Winston Churchill would cite Disraeli in the remark, "The Lord deals with the nations as the nations deal with the Jews." And this was a double-edged comment promising difficulties for nations that would oppress their Jewish populations, as well as a blessing for those that would defend them. Churchill's story recapitulates a whole school of thought that was prevalent in the early 20th century in England that would provide the eventual political support for the rise of the Zionist movement. After the breakup of the Ottoman Empire as a result of the First World War, the League of Nations approved the mandate for Palestine based on the Balfour Declaration's support for creating a Jewish homeland. So Britain was directly responsible for this. And you can see how the British king would be someone the Sanhedrin would accept, and that he could be the one to broker the peace between the so-called Arab Palestinians and the Jews and solve the problem that was created by the division of the land way back then. It's already happened. So watchmen need to stop saying, oh, they're getting ready to divide God's land, because it's been a long time that it happened ago. And the Palestinian Mandate gave recognition to the historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine. It did not create a new national right, but rather acknowledged a pre-existing right that was broadly accepted in international circles within the Leagues of Nations at the time. Although Makovsky does not specifically deal with the legal background of how the Palestine Mandate was drafted, it becomes clear when reading his work how British diplomats would come to adopt this kind of language. So their whole system was established by the British monarchy through the British Mandate and British-ruled Palestine. So the last 7 years, the Sanhedrin puts the British king as the king over them. You could see how, because they had been a British territory under the British Empire at one time, that they could go back to accepting King Charles III to be the anointed one with the olive oil, that the olives were plucked from the Mount of Olives, where the king's grandmother is buried, and I think it's an aunt that's buried there. And then they crushed the olives for his anointing in Bethlehem. the very place of the real Messiah. So, in fact, in June of 1922, Churchill would declare that the Jews had returned to Palestine as of right and not by sufferance, and that this was based on their ancient historical connection. Speaking before the Peel Commission years later in 1937, Churchill snapped at a commission member who referred to the Jews in Palestine as, quote, a foreign race, end quote. For Churchill, the Jewish people were the true indigenous population of the land. Amen. And the Jews had Palestine before that indigenous population, the Arabs, came in, invaded, and inhabited it. Anyone reading Makowski's book who thinks that Churchill backed the rise of a Jewish national homeland in Palestine because of his concerns with protecting the British Empire's strategic interests will be surprised. In some Western academic circles, where the rise of the Zionist movement is seen as a manifestation of Western imperialism, it is just assumed that Britain's motivation for sustaining its wartime support for the Balfour Declaration in the interwar years came out of imperial calculations. Britain sought to safeguard the approaches to its imperial jewel, India, which required control of the Suez Canal in the west, Cape Town in the south, Singapore in the east, and Palestine along the eastern Mediterranean. But in the 1920s, when Churchill was Britain's colonial secretary, his primary consideration was finding ways of containing the expansion of the newly formed Soviet Union. Initially, he even opposed the breakup of the Ottoman Empire and eventually focused on strengthening British-Turkish ties for the same reason. And he was hardly enthusiastic about Britain assuming new imperial responsibilities in the Arab provinces of the former Ottoman Empire. So there's something like 22 Arab countries, and these people that were Muslims that invaded started calling themselves Palestinians. So truly, the indigenous people are the Jewish people, as we know from the Bible, and God tells us so. It becomes clear reading Makowski that for Churchill, a peace treaty with post-Ottoman Turkey was Britain's paramount Middle East interest. Had the new Turkish state not relinquished sovereignty over the former Arab provinces and created a vacuum for the claims of various national movements, one wonders how Churchill's whole view of the Zionist enterprise would have changed. Still, what emerges from Makowski is that Churchill never lost his fundamental sympathy with the restoration of Jewish sovereignty. Enraged at the Attlee Bevin government's hostility toward the new state, he declared in the House of Commons in 1948 that Israel's independence was, quote, an event in world history to be viewed in the perspective not of a generation or a century, to be viewed in the perspective not of a generation or a century, but in the perspective of 1,000, 2,000, or even 3,000 years. Many of Churchill's public statements, but never diluted his faith in Israel's cause. So some of this is written by Dory Gold from Israel. It really tells you everything about that the land was already divided. So everybody that's been waiting for that to happen and saying, you know, the United States is going to divide the land, it happened long, long ago. And the British monarchy was very much responsible. So this is why I believe King Charles III plays a role still in the end time events with the building of the temple and, whoever becomes king on the Davidic throne in place of, as a replacement, an Antichrist figure, and sits in the Jewish temple proclaiming himself to be God. So to sum this up, while Winston Churchill didn't single-handedly divide the land of Israel, he did play a significant role in shaping the borders of the British Mandate of Palestine, particularly by creating Transjordan, now the nation state of Jordan, out of a large portion of the original territory that was meant for the Jewish nation. And this decision made in 1922 is often seen as a key factor in the later division of Palestine and the establishment of the nation state of Israel. The British mandate after World War I, the League of Nations, granted Britain a mandate over what was then called Palestine, which was the made-up name making fun of the Jewish people with the name Philistine. It had been renamed by one of the Roman emperors to mock the Jews. And during the Jewish revolt, this was part of why the Jews were revolting, and they were dispersed out of the land and out of Jerusalem and everything else. So basically, they've been just coming back to reclaim what God promised them. In 1921, Churchill, as colonial secretary, convened the Cairo Conference, where he helped establish the borders of the modern Middle East. A major outcome of the conference was the decision to separate Transjordan, the eastern part of the mandate, from the area intended for the Jewish national home. And as I said before, 75% of it was given to them that had been promised to the Jews. So now it wound up being this little narrow place along, the Mediterranean Sea on one side and Jordan on the other, on the other side of the Jordan River. It was called Jordan because of the Jordan River. And the Jordan River separates the two. Before that, when Jews escaped during the time that the temple was destroyed, if you know this history, a lot of these Jews that became Christians, I should say Christians that fled because they knew that Jesus had told them what was coming. They fled to a place called Pella in Jordan now. And before that, there was no barrier. They could just go across the land. There was nothing to keep. There was no Jordan. Okay? So it was the land that continued on, and they went and hid in these caves, some of which the archaeologists have discovered that were basically first century Jewish dugouts where they hid in these caves down below. So you kind of have to know this history to know all this, and I do a lot of research in history and historical events, but this is really horrific. So, these people are in Palestine claiming that it's theirs when it wasn't even theirs to begin with. So while the UN partition plan of 1947 formally divided Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states, Churchill's earlier decision regarding Transjordan significantly reduced the area available for a Jewish state. So they divided up my land. Is that why the judgment's going to come on the king that's going to replace King Jesus, because they won't accept him as their king, but they'll accept another who comes in his own name? Now, Churchill was a long-standing supporter of the Zionist idea of a Jewish national home in Palestine. However, he also recognized the need to balance this with the interests of the Arab population, who have 22 nations that are Arab Muslim nations. So there's no reason why they cannot go there or go back to where their ancestors came from. But since historians argue that Churchill's decision to create Transjordan, while intending to address political realities of the time, ultimately contributed to the complex and enduring Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In essence, Churchill's actions, particularly the creation of Transjordan, influenced the latter partition of Palestine and the establishment of the State of Israel, though he was not directly responsible for the UN partition plan. And the area now known as Jordan was previously known as Transjordan before it became the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan in 1946. The Ottoman Empire, the region was part of the Ottoman Empire, the Muslim invaders, until its dissolution It was a caliphate, and the caliphate was rooted out of Palestine with the help of the British. And the Ottoman Empire's dissolution after World War I. British mandate following the war, Transjordan was established as a British mandate in 1921 independence. Formation of the Kingdom of Jordan gained independence from British rule on May 25, 1946, and was officially recognized as a kingdom. The name Jordan reflects the Jordan River, which forms part of its western border. So, to put this in perspective, when I was writing in my book, The Almond Tree, Aaron's Rod, the Messiah, King of Israel, and I had this feeling that Jesus was baptized in this certain area that was where Christians, Jews, were not allowed to go to that area. The Jordanians had, like barbed wire fencing, and they kept people out of there. They had soldiers with rifles, and you could not visit the real place where Jesus was baptized. But that all changed after my book was published, and people could suddenly start going to that location. So that was really something else. And so I'm just kind of sharing some of the historical details that I've researched and, put together in my book. And it's truly history that everybody needs to know, because these young whippersnappers do not even know this history, and they don't know about the Roman emperor mocking the Jews, trying to drive them out of the land, destroy their temple and their worship and all of that. And God said that he would scatter them among the nations, but he also said that he would bring them back into their land and they would not be uprooted ever again. So it's important to know this history. So I'm just sharing this little bit with you to tell you that if Watchman keeps saying, that the land's going to be divided, it's already done. And it was done a long time ago in the early 20th century. So these are really important details to understand. So with that, I'll just say good night. Thank you for watching. Thank you for any support of my channel. I greatly appreciate it. And thank you for some of the loving people who commented about my home being for sale, and God willing, I could get it back. I have to go somewhere. Might as well go home, right? Yeah, right. It's going to take a miracle of God if that could ever happen. But anyway, shalom for now. Keep these thoughts in mind, because since the division already happened of the land, we're not really looking for that anymore. What's coming next is going to be the red heifer ceremony, the anointing of a king to sit on the throne of David, and the building of the temple in Jerusalem. Meanwhile, God has been gathering out Gentiles as a bride for himself, since he allowed some of the Jews' eyes to be blinded to his identity until the 7-year time of Jacob's trouble, where they'll have to call out for him and realize he's the true King of Judah, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, coming to sit on his throne and reign and rule forever. Shalom for now. These are exciting times we're living in. And there's one thing I wanted to mention. If you want to see a really good movie about Queen Victoria, it has to do with Queen Victoria's life, especially when she lost Albert, her husband. And it was a 1997 movie called Mrs. Brown, and it starred Judi Dench, the famous British actress. And it kind of goes into the whole story about Benjamin Disraeli that I mentioned here, and how she went up to the Highlands with him and some of the representatives of the Queen that assisted the Queen when Albert died, went to take Benjamin Disraeli up to the Scottish Highlands and have meetings up there regarding some of these issues. So it was a very well done movie. I really enjoyed that movie. I loved the character of I cannot remember the gentleman's name, but he was the one who took care of the Queen's horses, Queen Victoria, that is, and helped her in her grieving state. And there was rumors that she may have been involved with him or fell in love with him or something. So it was really a very interesting story. And you should go watch it if you are interested in that type of historical movie. Plus, I liked the scenery in Scotland, and, you know, the gentleman who befriended the Queen was a very good actor, and I really thought it was fantastic. Called Mrs. Brown, 1997, about Queen Victoria, starring Judi Dench, the very famous British actress. This is why I think the British King is going to play a huge role in the future of the peace between the two sides, because they're the ones that started the division and created some of these issues and problems through all of this last century and so far part of this century. And one more thing before I go. I just uncovered something by reading this. Do you remember when Obama was so rude to Benjamin Netanyahu? And I think he made him come through the kitchen at the White House or something to make an entrance. It was something really rude that he did. But do you remember that he removed the bust of Churchill out of the White House and sent it back to Britain? And now you know, because of his Muslim instincts, that he was against the state of Israel. You know why the bust of Churchill was sent back to Britain. Because of these things. And that is truly astonishing to realize the real reason, because we didn't fully understand what was going on with that when it was happening. But this explains everything to me. I'm pretty good at figuring out puzzles. So I just figured this one out. I wanted to add that here at the end. I'll see you a little bit later. I just wanted to say this because I suddenly realized it. Have a nice evening, everyone.